Good morning to those joining from Asia. Good evening to those joining from North America. And greetings to those joining from Brazil and other parts of the world. Welcome to this short course on Asian and Asian American Feminist Theologies. My name is Kwok Pui Lan, and I am the Dean's Professor of Systematic Theology at Kendra School of Theology at Emory University. I have written and edited many books, including Post-Colonial Imagination and Feminist Theology. My newest book, Post-Colonial Politics and Theology, will be published this fall. This course is offered by Kendra Foundry in partnership with Pacific Asian and North American Asian Women in Theology and Ministry, PANATOM. PANATOM began as a small group of Asian and Asian American women who were enrolled in theological schools or worked in ministry in 1984. This year, we celebrate our 36th year. Today, we organize annual conferences and workshops, mentor women leaders in church and academy, and work for social change. I am very grateful to the director of Kendra Foundry, Dr. Ryan Bonfilio, and program coordinator Crystal Golden for their support and assistance. I also want to thank our fabulous tech team, Unjong, Janine, Unjin, who work behind the scenes to support us. At a time when the Asian Pacific has become a strategic region poised to shape the future of the 21st century, this short course will introduce to you some of the important Asian and Asian American women theologians and scholars and their work. We hope you will actively participate in the conversations by posting on the chat. You can also put your questions in the Q&A. There will be also opportunities for you to engage with one another in Zoom room discussion. Now I want to show you the schedule of this short course and the speakers for each session. So tonight, we have Asian and Asian American Feminist Theologies, a transnational approach. Dr. Muriel Ovevillo-Montenegro will join me in this session. Then next week, we will focus on biblical studies on gender and class. Dr. Gail Yi and Dr. Maggie Load will be the speakers. The following week will be on Christian ethics and sexuality. Dr. Kim Jun, Christine Pei, and Dr. Sharon Bong will be the speakers for that session. Then on June 8th, will be on interreligious learning and solidarity. Dr. Sen Kassam and Dr. Aruna Nanandasan will be the speakers for that session. The last session will be on leadership and ministry, during which Dr. Bongyong Lee and Dr. Satami Nakawa will be the speakers. PANATOM has published 3 books. The most recent one is Asian and Asian American Women in Theology and Religion. Earlier, we published Leading Wisdom and Of the Manual. Please visit our website for more resources, and there are videos on our website, and you can also find recordings of PANATOM's past webinars on our YouTube channel. Now, I want to introduce to you the speaker for tonight. Our first speaker will be Dr. Muriel Ovevillo-Montenegro, who is a Filipina feminist theologian, a teacher, learner, a mother, and a gardener. She was a church youth worker and worked with an NGO before joining the faculty of Silliman University Divinity School in the Philippines, where she served as its first female dean. She received her PhD from Union Theological Seminary in New York. Her research interests and publications range from topics in theology, ethics, liturgy, interreligious understanding, disability, ecology, and peace studies. She's the author of the book, The Jesus of Asian Women. Muriel is a member of the Association of Women in Theology in the Philippines and the Asian Women's Resource Center, and co-founder of the Philippine Ecumenical Peace Platform. Currently, she serves as the coordinator of the Interfaith Cooperation Forum, a project of the Asian and Pacific Alliance of YMCAs, and based in Hong Kong. Muriel.
Thank you. Thank you, Pui Lan, for that introduction. Good morning, everyone. I will have a screen share here. My task this morning, good evening also there in the US. My task this morning is to introduce the Asian Feminist Theologies, being the first speaker. So the Asian Feminist Theologies did not just come from nowhere or anywhere. So maybe for us, we'll have a quick view of the context of Asian feminist theology. It comes from Asia, of course, which is the largest of the Earth's 7 continents. It covers 8.6% of the Earth's total surface area. And according to those who studied on Asia, it is the most popular, very prolific. The people in Asia are very prolific. It has more than 60% of the world's current human population. And I checked, it still is. So Asian, when we see the word Asian, it's not monolithic. It's diverse, very diverse. An example of that is that it's the birthplace of some of the world's oldest civilization. And it's also the birthplace of variety of living religions, spiritualities, cultures, traditions, races, languages, and even political governance. And there's so many issues that are interconnected, and this confront the Asian women, the Asian people, and especially the Asian women. And there are many more issues of survival. So we need to look back, because as I've said, Asian feminist theologies did not just emerge out of nowhere. The Asian theologies, like male theologies generally, had been had emerged, and they had been looking into indigenization, like how can we speak as Asian? So they looked into the approach of indigenization, which is, well, they sought to set the community of faith from the colonized consciousness by conferring on a liturgy or a theology, a cultural form that is native to the people. But it also meant reading the sacred text of the communities. And then in the 70s, there was enculturation. And according to this Chupunco, a Filipino whose work was focused on liturgies, enculturation seek to transform the authentic cultural values through their integration into Christianity and the rooting of Christianity in various cultures. And as we look back, however, Enculturation and indigenization did not pay attention to the social context of Asia. So theologians gathered, and this word was introduced actually with the World Council of Churches, contextualization, looking at the context. And it challenges the theologians to take seriously the context of contemporary struggles for economic security, social justice, and political freedom. And it also challenges the church to be relevant. And so they would say, well, they ask actually, what does it mean to contextualize the gospel? And they would say that contextualization is not optional, because this is the locus of theologizing. But then Asian women began to ask, oh, well, they said the Asian women supported the theologizing that considered the approach of indigenization, enculturation, and contextualization. But the women found that these Asian theologies are inadequate because the women's voices are absent, were absent from Asian theology. So they ask, why are women's voices absent from Asian theologies? Why do Asian theologies not address the multiplicity of our day-to-day experiences as women in Asia? So they were thinking and asking more questions. Why is the prevailing concept and language in theology male-centered? Why are the voices and experiences not included in theological discourse? And why is the language in liturgies, hymns, prayers, and sermons do not include us as God's daughters? And why is the church language trying to erase the memory of our cultures? So these are just some of the questions that the women raised. So they said that there must be serious attention to the pervasive human problem of subordinating of most women, because this led to the deep questioning of just about anything that affects women's lives in Asia, and we know that anywhere else it's the same too. So the story of Asian feminist theology actually began when women claimed their voices as priestesses, so presided over community rituals as community leaders, and the women looked back into the traditions of the shamans, the babaylanes, the mudangs, and told their stories and experiences, and shared pre-patriarchal stories of creation and other myths of the diwatas, or the goddesses that celebrate female power. For example, Mebuyan, the many-breasted goddess, or Aluncina, who created the earth. And but of course, there were no written materials yet in those times. And they inquired into the deep relationship of embodiment, power, identity. They asked more questions about the meaning of what does it mean to be created, or the meaning of being created in God's image as women. And they explored critically the idea that women are only second class in position vis-a-vis the men. Why is that? And they reflected on the interest of those who reinforce the sense of superiority while keeping others in subordinate roles. So they examined theologically the conditions of violence and subjection. They analyzed many specific social norms and practices. They questioned the unjustly biased premises and starting points in talking about God and human being. They raised questions about their subjectivity, our subjectivity, and knowledge from the perspectives of women. So how do women know God? This is just the basic question, because well, as you know, in even during the time of the so-called fathers of the church, it was said that women have no capacity to talk about God, to know God, to talk about spirituality, and many more. So the voices of the Asian women emerged, and there were pioneers. The first one to publish a book on Asian theology was an Indonesian woman, Marian Katupo, who reflected on Asian women's experience of being treated as the other. So her book came out in 1979, entitled Compassionate and Free. But this little book has been a landmark in the emerging voices of Asian women. And then a few years after, Aruna Dason from India, I think she was still working with the National Council of Churches in India at this time. She wrote the book Theology of Humanhood, Women's Perspectives. And this focused on, in a way, saying that women are human beings. So we have the right to speak up. We have the right to articulate who God is from our experience. And then more women's voices emerged. In 1989, Virginia Fabila, along with Sun A. Park, came out with this book, We Dare to Dream. And then that was followed by a book that came out from a Korean woman, Chung Yung Kyung, The Struggle to Be the Sun Again. And then came the more prolific Asian feminist theologian, our host, Kwok Pui Lan, came out with this book in 1992, The Chinese Women and Christianity, within a particular period. And then that was followed by a book entitled Discovering the Bible in a Non-Biblical World. And then after that, more the women from Asia were encouraged, were inspired, and they came out with more books. And In God's Image came out. This is a feminist journal from Asia. I have to say that a theologian from my seminary, the seminary where I studied my basic theology, said that, oh, this is not a journal because, you know, there are drawings and there are pictures. A journal should have no pictures. But then I said, well, that's a feminist journal. It's not boring like the traditional journal created by the men. And then more women came out with those books. Iwa came out with their journal also, and from the World Council of Churches again. Now this time, Aruna was in the WCC, and many other books. In 1996, there was this Beyond Bonding coming from Itwat, but written particularly by Virginia Fabila. And then this one is from India, and then from Japan, and this one is from India, and this one is from, I think this was from AWRC, and then Wong Wei Ching, Satoku Yamaguchi, Hisako Kinukawa, and then yours truly, and many more. In the Philippines also, the women were inspired to come out with more books, published books. So the voices of women began to be heard. And there were women's circles in theology that were created or that emerged also. I think this came, I remember Elizabeth Tapia was, by the way, Elizabeth Tapia is the first woman, a Filipino woman who got a PhD in theology. They created Philippine Association of Theologically Trained Women, or PATU, which became in the Philippines AWIT, or Association of Women in Theology. And then we know that Korean women also had KAUT, or Korean Association of Women in Theology. And then ITWOT created a Women's Commission. And in 1987, the AWRC, or Asian Women's Resource Center for Culture and Theology, came out, or was emerged. Now, of course, the women in Asia engaged in dialogue with the white feminists, the womanists, mujeristas, African women, Latinas, and Asian women in diaspora. Dialogue in terms of reading their books, some face-to-face, and many other activities. There were no Zoom yet in those days, so we would say that the attendance probably compared to this webinar is limited because you have to travel, and there was no Skype or Zoom or any, the technology was not available yet in those days. So what is a Asian feminist theology, or what are the feminist Asian theologies? Theologies, because it's plural, of course. These theologies are constructed by women in Asia, located in diverse Asian contexts, say class, ethnicities, race, etc. And it is by nature, it is liberationist in vision and praxis, grounded on social reality. So I have to say that the theologies that came out from Asia does not romanticize the struggles, because the struggle is real, as you have seen in the previous slides that I've shown, the context. So, well, there is this diversity of context, diversity of struggles, but there is one commonality, that is to resist and fight patriarchy. And I think Asian women, share the vision of all women, or the feminist women, is to have or to attain the fullness of life for all people, not just for women, but for all people. We have to emphasize this because many of the men, both in the seminaries and in churches, kind of resist or stayed away from feminism because they thought that women would want to take their place. But we have to emphasize that the vision is the fullness of life for all, and we want the men to be liberated also from patriarchy. And well, more books came out. I would say from the Asian women, I think Kwok Pui Lan is the most prolific. And then, as you can see, there is hope, as you can see in the title. But Gemma Tulud Cruz, who is a Filipina, also is looking at migration, which is a phenomenon in Asia. Especially Indonesia and Philippines are the countries that supply most of the domestic workers to different countries in the world. And then Kang Nam Soon looked at the diasporic feminist theology and the Asian theopolitical imagination. This picture was taken in 2015 when Asian women gathered in Manila in June 2015 to discuss many things about the diversities and commonalities that binds the Asian women. And this was initiated, I think, by Pui Lan again. So what are the challenges that Asian feminist theologies face today? If you look at the 2021 context, I put here, it's more than a deja vu, because it's like we're going back to the past. There is patriarchy still, still in terms of child care. There is still domestic violence. The farmers are still suffering because of this GMOs that created by this Monsanto, and don't have time to discuss about the effect of this. But yes, domestic violence and, of course, McDonaldization continues. And all kinds of products coming from multinational, transnational corporations. And now, the emerging thing is China. Whatever we wear, I was telling my friends when we were in Japan that we go shopping and we will look at some things there. But then we realized that a lot of things are made in China, so that we cannot escape from China these days. And of course, the climate justice, the crisis issues. And capitalism is very much alive these days. And then more issues. Now, here comes COVID. And COVID has complicated the lives of people. Those who are poor became poorer. Violence has become more intense, especially among the women. They have experienced more domestic violence, cases of violence inside the homes, and the children too. Perhaps the trauma and the stress also has created a lot of insecurities. And of course, well, this is an image from India. And of course, 2019, the pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong came, and then last year, the national security law was imposed. And of course, in the Philippines, I think Philippines is copying China also, because our president is a good friend of China. So they also now impose the anti-terrorism law, which is very big, same with NSL. And even the community pantries that tried to address the situation of hunger because of COVID, it was red tag. If you put up a community pantry, they would say, oh, that's a communist. But when I say communist, of course, China is a communist, but the Philippines is red tagging and arresting people who are supposed to be the local communists. And in India, the women farmers are protesting. We're protesting. This was in February. In Thailand, the women were, women were also staging protest rallies in solidarity with Myanmar. As we know, Myanmar is now under the military junta. And of course, the gadgets are influencing our lives too, or sometimes even enslaving us. And this is the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative of China. it says that there are now 133 to 140 countries that have signed an MOU with China for the BRI. And this is in Sri Lanka, this is in the Philippines, this is a disputed area in the West Philippine Sea, because the Philippines had already won the case in the ICC. And of course, Cambodia is with that too. So there are disputes, internal disputes within Asia also. So when Asian women wrote, at least from us, those who are located in Asia, I think we wrote, even if we read materials from the US and the white, those feminists and Asian women who were in the US, who are in the US, I think there was not much consciousness of engaging in our writings, the women from there. But now, I mean, as the days and the years went by, the Asian women were more conscious of engaging in dialogue with women coming from the other side of the Pacific. So what are now the challenges, given the recent context that Asian feminist theology or Asian theology in general must address? There is a challenge of the nexus of the notion nationhood. I know that some people are worried about this notion of nationalism, but for those people who had been colonized and are still colonized until now, this is still an issue. Nationalism is still an issue. And of course, this neo-colonization and deterritorialization, it's a tongue twister. So the question is, how will we honor people's sovereignty in the face of the state becoming a proxy of foreign powers, who are violating, the people's bodies, rights, earth rights, and cultures? And there are more questions that could be asked in line with that. And then, of course, there is this ecocide. Again, this is a nexus of ecocide, biocolonization, biocide, and the ecological impact. We know that the climate crisis is is rising. It's becoming so difficult, and there's a chain of effects related to this planetary security because of this crisis. And reclaiming indigenous identity and minority rights. While we talk of transnationalism and there's hybridity of identity, but for me, we cannot even talk of hybridity of identity without establishing first who we are. Who am I? It's only when I know who am I, my indigenous identity, can I or will I be able to engage with other identities? And so it's important for the Asian women to look into this and to look back, look into our local cultures, our wisdom, because these have been systematically suppressed and marginalized. In fact, the indigenous peoples now in Asia, and I think even all over the world, also have become internally displaced peoples. And this is another phenomenon that we need to address. And then there is this issue of spirituality, the theme of spirituality, what is now our definition of spirituality? Because there is an observation that there is loss of focus in spiritual formation vis-a-vis our lifestyles, the loss of indigenous wisdom, the character and values. And that is because of, globalization, all those things. And then religious fundamentalisms are emerging, not just among Christians, but within the living religions of Asia. And as always, we thought that the struggle of the women for gender justice is almost over, but it's not over. It's not even almost over, because the sexual exploitation in the workplaces, trafficking in persons, violence, gender deficit in institutions, the exclusion of the LGBT people in the communities are still there. And then we have this technology, the information overload, social media, and fake news. There are pros and cons here, because without the technology, we cannot meet we cannot meet through Zoom. Some are in the US or Europe or in other areas of Pacific and in Asia, but we cannot meet face to face, or perhaps if we can, granting that there's no pandemic. But the expenses of travel is very much difficult, especially those of us coming from Asia. But there are downsides to this, because of this technology has been used also to exploit women and children. Cyber sex, cyber pornography is prevalent. What else? I think I've mentioned this, eco-side-by-side and ecological impact. And then globalization, migration, and forced migration. Migration, for me, there are people who just on their own volition, they want to move to other countries. But many people are forced to migrate because of economic issues, political issues, and social issues. So these are intertwined also. And we talked about identity earlier, but again, I connect this with the power struggles also. There are post-colonial construction of identities, yes, it's true. And there are hybridities, but we also need to look at our accountabilities. And there are people's movements. As you can see, the rallies, the protest rallies are signs and products of people's movements, connectivities, and ecumenism. There are many religious traditions in Asia, or spiritualities, even cultures. And so it is important also to address this issue to promote wider engagements with different religions and cultures. And there are many, many more challenges. I think my time is almost over. There are many, many social challenges. I think this is found all over Asia. Greed, corruption. I only last night, when I attended this Asia-Europe forum, that there are even extrajudicial killings happening in Bangladesh. And this is very much taking place in the Philippines too. Insurgencies and peace talks and many others. So how do we theologize in the face of all this? The challenge is for us to draw out meaning and reflections from our own diverse context. We need to draw water from our own wells, and recognize that Asian women come from different backgrounds, ethnicities, economic, social, and geographical locations. We have different nationalist sentiments, vis-a-vis the sentiments from the old and new imperialist countries. We need to construct Asian and Pacific theologies in dialogue with critical theories. And I think most of the Asian women in diaspora are good in this, but we need to give more attention to this. And conscious engagement, dialogue with women across the Pacific, engage women from different traditions, faith traditions and religious traditions, address the issues affecting women in Asia and Pacific, and this come from the context. Reimagine the female body. A lot of women are doing this already, but we need to do more. Reimagine the female body, sexuality, birthing, menopause, aging, widowhood, disability, illnesses, and many others. And then rethink motherhood. What does it mean to be a mother? And raising feminist children. Is motherhood only biological motherhood? We can ask more questions also. Engage in visioning the future of Asian feminist theology amidst diversity. What is really our goal? So again, there are more questions to ask. There is some, sorry, repeating. Some are practical questions that I think because of feedbacks from different women and people in the church, we need to ask, how do our theologies empower women in the pews, in the streets, in the homes? Or how do we make our theologies accessible to women outside the academe? Because I've read an article, I think that was from Limatula Lungcomer in God's Image, that women that are, you know, she calls it dominant women, but I think what she refers is the women in the academe, because the women in the academe are the ones who are able to publish. But how do we make these theologies accessible to women outside the academe? How do we help women understand the Bible? Until now, when I preached 2 Sundays ago about lamentation of what's happening in the Philippines, what's happening in Asia, in Myanmar, in India, there are still women, even among the congregation here was the domestic helpers. Why do we talk about politics? So it's still that old understanding of separating the church and the state. We cannot talk about politics in our theology. So how do we help women understand our theologies that is inclusive, that is holistic? So that's the ultimate, for me, the ultimate challenge. And my time is up. Thank you very much for the sharing.
Thank you very much for this beautiful presentation, both the substance and also the format. So I want to present on Asian and Asian American feminist theologies, a transnational approach. Some of you may ask why we need a transnational approach, why it is not contextual theology based on one particular context. For example, from Taiwan or Canada or Brazil. Why transnational? Would it be too broad? So transnational means that people, capital, labor, and resources have been moving across national lines. And as Muriel already spoke about globalization, today transnational or globalization is moving in a very fast speed. I have defined a transnational analysis as an approach that will help us see Asia and America not as two separate entities, but as constantly influencing each other within the broader regional formation of the Asian Pacific. First, if you look at the immigration history of the United States, or Canada for that matter, you will see different waves of Asian immigrants arrived on this soil. The Filipino early immigrants, the sugarcane workers in Hawaii from Japan, and you have Chinese coming, especially to the West Coast, and Sikh Americans or Indian Americans arriving as well. United States have been engaged in several major wars in Asia. The earlier Spanish-American War in late 19th century, the war with Japan in the Second World War, Korean War in the early 50s, and of course, the Vietnam War. So before Asian Pacific became a region that we are talking about or excited about, Asia has been war zones for the United States. And then with the coronavirus being labeled as China virus or Kung Flu, there was rising anti-Asian hatred incidents. Since March 2020, more than 4,000 such cases have been reported. So what is happening in the United States, of course, cannot be separated from what is happening in Asia and other parts of the world. And the image of Asian Americans in the United States has always been influenced, if not defined, by Americans' image about Asia. That is why a transnational approach will be important. Who are the Asian Americans? In 2020, there are about 20 million Asian Americans, about 5.6% of the population. This is the fastest growing racial and ethnic group. The largest ethnic groups among Asian Americans are Chinese, Filipino, Indian, and Vietnamese. It is noteworthy that about 62% of Asian Americans are foreign-born. About 3/4 of Asian Americans live in metropolitan areas. According to a Gallup survey, about 4.3% of Asian Americans identify themselves as LGBTQI persons. In the year 2012, Pew Center did a research, Asian Americans, a mosaic of faiths. Here you can see Christians comprise 42% of the Asian American population. 14% of them are Buddhist, 10% are Hindus. And it is significant, almost 1/4 of Asian Americans said they are not affiliated with any religious traditions. Now I want to talk about the rise of Asian American theology. Although Asian American Christians have articulated their faith and reflected on their Christian experience, a much more conscious attempt to do Asian American theology started in the late 60s and early 70s during the Civil Rights Movement. Because of the participation in the Civil Rights Movement, Asian Americans came together and they used this political term, Asian American, to designate themselves. And during that time, many Asian Americans formed their own churches or Christian communities. They do not want to be just part of a tiny minority of the white mainstream churches. You may recall that Asian American studies also started during that time, in the midst of the push for ethnic studies in the universities. The first generation of Asian American theologians. We have Bishop Royal Sano, Japanese American, Fumitaka Masuoka, also Japanese American. And we have Dr. Jong-Yong Lee, our leading Korean American scholar who has written one of the pioneering book, Marginality. As you can see, the first generations are mostly male scholars. But you will see Asian American women are not voiceless. In this one of the early anthologies of the Theologies of Asian Americans and Pacific Peoples, edited by Royal Sano, published in 1976, you will see women such as Joanne Miyamoto, Violet Masuda, Donna Wong Dong, and others who contributed to this early volume. Their voices should not be forgotten. As Muriel introduced to you Asian women's networks, I want to introduce to you some of the major Asian North American networks. I want to focus on the third one, Penautumn, 1984. Women have also participated in other networks. For example, in the Institute for the Study of Asian American Christianity, one of the founders, Yang Lee Hertig, is a Korean American. And the current chair of the Association of Asian North American Theological Educators is also a woman, Dr. Christine Hong. But unlike our sisters in Asia, there were not a proliferation of different Asian American women's networks. So when Asian Americans, men and women, began to articulate their theology, one very important issue would be to talk about racism and also conceptualizing their own identity. Dr. Jong-Yong Lee, in his book, talks about marginality, using the figure of Jesus as an example, to talk about Jesus as a Jew was also marginalized in his own time, and using this particular lens to talk about how Asian Americans can contribute to new understanding of Christian faith. Fumitaka Masuoka and Sung-Kun Lee used liminality to talk about the hyphenated identities of Asian Americans. Frank Yamada and Ann Cho use hybridity and heterogeneity to talk about Asian Americans being very diverse and our hybrid identity as both Asian and American. But let us focus on what Japanese American theologian Rita Nagashima-Brock has offered, because many Asian American women have found her conceptualization helpful. She coined the term interstitial integrity. By this, she means, this is the spirit in us, our struggle to hold the many in the one. We endeavor to make sense and meaning out of the multiple social locations, the hybrid cultures, and the many powers of death and life that are placed before us. In this book that I edited and published last year, Asian and Asian American Women in Theology and Religion, Embodying Knowledge, Rita Nagashima-Brock Gail Yi, and many other Asian and Asian American women shared their understanding of their racial identity, their experience of being Asian or Asian American, and how that understanding shaped or formed their Christian belonging and understanding. So I invite you to get hold of a copy of this book, and you will read those marvelous stories. Another issue besides racism and gender that Asian American women theologians talk about is war and militarism, given the background that I have just alluded to. For example, in this book, Critical Theology Against U.S. Militarism in Asia, edited by Nami Kim and Ann Cho, the editors write, "It is critical that Christian theology offers an account of its relationship to militarized violence today." As Muriel also just told us of the keen competition between China and United States, leading many Asian countries almost have to decide which side that they would be supporting. Today, in the East Sea, and then in the South Sea, there is also keen competition between the US and China. That is why, for Nami Kim and Ann Cho, we have to remember wars and militarism in Asia in the past, and to analyze the present situation in order to speak out prophetically as Asian and Asian American women. I want to share with you some of the things that younger Asian and Asian Americans are doing in the United States. First, I want to introduce to you to this doctoral student from Vanderbilt University, Nama Hoi San Lok. She is from the Kachin tribe in Myanmar. As many of us know that, Myanmar is under a very difficult situation because of the military coup. In April, Pan Autumn held our annual conference. Nama Hoi San Lok was one of the speakers. And then she talks about the difficult political situation her country faces. She talks about survival and said, "Survival is not new for people on the margin. Survival is a daily practice for persons and communities of color at work, at school, in the public and private places." She urges us to practice embodied solidarity and collective care. In addition to doing the work that she does to articulate a feminist theology for Myanmar, she has also done research work on catching Christian communities in the United States. That is why her work is transnational, looking both at Myanmar and the struggle and suffering of the people there, as well as catching people and the wider Myanmar Christian communities located in North America. Another scholar I want to introduce to you is Dr. Helen Jin Kim's forthcoming book, Race for Revival: How Cold War South Korea Shaped American Evangelical Empire. Again, she is using a transnational lens, not just looking at South Korean Christian history or US religious history, but look at it transnationally. In this book, She wants to talk about during the Cold War era, the Billy Graham Crusade, and other evangelical efforts in South Korea contributed to the rising of the political power of the evangelical communities in the United States. She said, when she did this research several years ago, she would not have imagined that her book will be so timely, because we all know that almost 80% of white evangelical Christians voted for former President Trump. And white evangelicalism today is so much tied to white nationalism. That is why I hope this book will help us understand even further how we cannot separate US and its involvement not only militarily and politically in other parts of the world, especially in Asia, but also religiously, how by looking at US and South Korean religious history together, that we can have new insights to look at the world today. I also want to introduce to you a queer feminist theologian, and this is Jung Hee-Yoon. She completed her doctoral work at Drew University. She contributed a chapter to the book Asian and Asian American Women in Theology and Religion. Her chapter talks about finding home in the in-between space in Korean American churches. She talks about her theological journey, first in South Korea, and then she was searching for a theological home as a feminist and as a queer person. And later, she came to the United States to begin her studies. Again, she has to find a theological home in heterosexual Korean churches in America. That is why in this particular chapter, she talks about finding home as a journey into freedom. She talks about how, as queer persons, they need to challenge patriarchal and heterosexual biases in the church. And she imagined how can Korean American churches include those marginalized voices, including queer voices, in shaping communal identity. In this particular chapter, she also ends with the Korean concept of chong. Chong, she talks about as those sticky relations or connections. She hopes the reconnection with Korean resources and opening up that category will help us to develop a kind of queer feminist theology that will speak to the Korean American Christians. In 2019, many of us watched what was happening in the protests in Hong Kong. And then we watched waves and waves of other protests in Myanmar and Black Lives Matter in the United States and in many other cities in the world. During the last 2 years, we have witnessed mass protests and people's movements in Chile, in India, in other parts of Latin America, in the Middle East. One of the questions that we have to face is, what are our theological responses to people's movements and people's protests? When I listened to Muriel's presentation, my memories were brought back to the time when I was a college student in the early 70s. That was a time of ferment and protest in many Asian countries. I recalled visiting the Philippines, South Korea, Okinawa in Japan, and listening to students and other activists talking about the struggle for democracy, for human rights. Today, several decades later, we witnessed protests and ferment in many Asian countries, not only in Asia, but also in the United States. We have people who would think democracy would be not protected. We have seen growing fascism in United States and also in European and other countries as well. When the world is in crisis, when the planet is in crisis, what should Christians be doing? So I want to introduce to you what I have been thinking lately. I have been reading this book by a Portuguese social scientist by the name of Boaventura de Souza Santos. He has written this book, The End of the Cognitive Empire. He was saying that colonialism, capitalism, patriarchy, and capitalism does not just impact our social and political lives. It also impacts how we think, acquire, and develop knowledge. That is why the subtitle is The Coming of Age of Epistemologies of the South. By epistemologies of the South, he does not mean this in a geographical sense. That is, those of us who are participating in this webinar from the geographical South. Rather, anyone who supports people's movements and struggles for justice, human rights, and democracy will join this effort to decolonialize our mind and search for an epistemologies that will not be defined by the North. Yes, Asian and Asian American women are separated by a vast ocean, the Pacific. But my question is, as geopolitical relations in Asian Pacific will shape the 21st century, how can we encourage transnational and intersectional conversations on Asian and Asian American feminist theologies? That is why, in this particular course, we hope we will have transnational conversations. Sometime we hope we will have Zoom sessions that you can meet your counterparts in other parts of the world. And together, we will develop a theology of the South based on new epistemologies and understandings of the lives of men and women and of other genders who are searching and hoping for a liberating gospel that speaks to all. Thank you very much. So I would stop here, and I know that you have many questions already. And so I would like to invite Muriel to come back on the screen so that we can answer some of the questions. We know that there will not be time to answer all. But maybe, Muriel, I want to ask, one attendee asked the question, how does the rise of Asian feminist theologies track with the wider first wave or second wave or third wave feminism happening in the wider cultural sphere? Would you say that you belong to whatever generation and now there is upcoming generations?
If we read thank you for that question. It's if we read the materials, there I did not find a conscious or explicit statement of Asian feminist theologians saying that I belong to this or I belong to that period, or the first wave, second wave, or third wave of feminism. Somehow, even for myself, it's like a continuum, because while we are able to vote, and in the Philippines, you see, election has been always difficult because of vote buying, of all this. So even the notion of patriarchy came, I mean, the name patriarchy or the label came later. The women knew that they have to fight this, but we didn't have name for it. So I particularly had that experience. And then there's no I would say there's no material that would say I'm first wave, second wave, or third wave. We're not tracking that. But many of the women would track their story back to the experiences or the story of colonization, the experience of exploitation of women related to these world wars, the comfort women, for example. And so, yeah, that's my answer. Maybe other women, but as far as I have known, there's not much explicit identification of women saying, I belong to this first wave, second wave, third wave.
Thank you very much. Thank you. There is another question for both of us. As Asian feminist theologians, what is the primary step, embodied, cognitive, and scholarly, not that they are separated from each other, that you have been doing personally to do the crucial reckoning that is needed to uncover and undo the ties between Christianity and imperialist violence that is still going on in many parts of the world?
Because it's both of us, can you answer it first? I'm looking for the question actually.
I think that I remember Latinx theologians always talk about the everyday, the struggle of the everyday. And I think to answer this question, to undo the ties between Christianity and imperialist violence, and I think to pay attention to everyday practices. What are the rituals of humiliation? I am citing the work of John Bopalan, talking about rituals of humiliation. And what are the rituals of hope? And how can Christian churches be a beacon of hope through our rituals like Eucharist? And how can we have an inclusive, and how can we create our worship space as an in-between or third space, instead of reinforcing power and authority of the mainstream society? Muriel, I think we can talk about the ritual you have participated in and created. I fondly recall you are really a liturgist.
Yeah, it is very important. Liturgies, especially, is very important because to me, that's the only very specific way that we can reach out to the ordinary people, to the ordinary women, because they go to church. So they don't read our books. They don't read the articles that we write in the journals and things. So it is very important that our theology be articulated through the rituals. the liturgies, the songs, the prayers. These are very crucial for me. So I hope that more women will do, Asian and Asian American women will go into this creation of rituals that will nurture our people, not just the women, but especially even at the young age, the children. It's very important. We studied theology when we are older, but as a mother, I tried really to help my two boys grow up through the prayers that we have before eating and in the liturgies and children's worship services. I would say ritual is kind of embodiment also what we believe in. Thank
Thank
you.
you very much. Several of you asked if Jun Hee-yoon has published a book. Not yet. So I will let her know that you have expressed interest. But there are also other queer feminist theologians writing both from Asia and Asia America. For example, there is the work by Dr. Soo Young Park, and
Yeah.
there is also the work by Dr. Elizabeth Leung. If you want to know more about LGBTQI networks, both from North America and Asia, please look at our Pan Autumn YouTube channel because we have a recent webinar introducing that particular topic. Then there is this question, maybe we can both share our insights. What are the main obstacles for a transnational approach in North America, Asian and Pacific academic institutions?
What are the obstacles? From my experience as a faculty member of a seminary, one of the important, I would say, if this is an obstacle, is like you have shared so many books. We don't have many books in the library. And I've been part of ATISEA accreditation commission. That is I think there's very few, I don't know now, but I've been away from ATISEA for like 4 years already. My interest when I go to a seminary, I look at the library because that is a very important resource for a faculty to include the works of the Asian and feminist women in their courses, whether it's church history or biblical studies, theology, liturgy, Christian education, all those things. There is a scant resource. So to me, that's an obstacle. It's aside, of course, from the men who have difficulty in, including the feminist voices in their courses. But in doing theology, I think the library is an important resource. Of course, in my presentation, I said that the context is very important, but we still have to, as I said, engage in dialogue with people who had been writing about their own situations, their own struggles, their own understanding of who they are and what God means for us as believers. So that's I don't know if I answered your question, but that's just one obstacle that I have seen.
For us, I think the question is, in the United States, many of the seminaries are still so Eurocentric in our curriculum and in our epistemologies. That is why the obstacles of transnational is there is the assumption we do not need to learn from Asia. We constantly look back to Europe. So that is our problem. When we talk about race, very often we focus on the dynamics or the binary between the black and white. And Asians, Latinx, or Native Americans will not even feature in our syllabus. And for example, this semester, I am teaching a course on Asian and Asian American theologies. And the students told me in their other classes, they would not have that kind of opportunities to engage that body of material. I think it is important for those of you who are studying in divinity schools, seminaries, religion departments, or teaching, and to pay attention to the curriculum and the epistemologies. I think we can ask or we can demand our schools to be more responsible, and so that we can effect some changes. And that is also what this course is all about, that we take responsibility for our learning, we spread the words, and then we push for change. Because of time, we have only can only answer one question. And I think there is a question from a person who's white, or let me generalize, from a racial and ethnic identity who is not Asian or Asian North American. How can this person and people like this person be partners for our struggle and for our theological movement? Is this Asian and Asian American feminist theologies only for us, or it has wider implication? What will you say, Muriel?
I would say that it's important also for us to have partners from other groups, the whites, for example, especially that the white theology, as you've said, even in Asia, it's still very Eurocentric. The library is full of Eurocentric materials, and so faculty too. But it's important if this white person, whether male or female, is, how would I say that, is very interested and one would want to be in solidarity with us, because then because of that we can engage in dialogue with them. But if the intention is just to impose their ideas, I think it will not be productive. But for sure, a dialogue that recognizes the Asian and Asian Americans as on the equal footing, I think that will be more productive. So it's not, I would say that we are not that close. We are open because we want to learn, but we want them to hear our voices.
Yeah, I think that is what I want to say as well. Because I think for people who are marginalized, whether it's women or racial and ethnic minorities, or the poor, or who do not have the opportunity to receive so much education, and they have multiple consciousness, sometimes not just double, as Du Bois would say. But if we belong to a dominant group, we sometimes lose sight of the perspective of those who are on the underside of history. That is why I think unlearning what we have assumed will be very important. For myself, doing post-colonial work, I also have to unlearn what I have learned. Because those of us who have stayed in higher education for so long, we have been influenced by very Eurocentric or Euro-American ways of speaking, of doing theology, of doing our research, of writing to our academic friends. Okay? So I think it is important that those coming from other racial and ethnic groups, especially those who belong to the cultural dominant, the unlearning process is important, and to have this open mind to dialogue instead of to teach, isn't it? I'm referring to the so-called civilizing mission of the past.
Yeah.
So we must learn from our past mistakes and then to construct this epistemology from the South together. And then we will really contribute to lifting up the church and faith communities as centers of emancipation, as beacons of hope and for a bright future. And I hope you will join us next time, because next week we are going to talk about the Bible, which is very important for many Asian and Asian American Christian communities. We will have two very important scholars, Dr. Gil Yi, the one and only woman of color president of that august Society of Biblical Literature in 2019. And we are going to have Dr. Maggie Low from Singapore, who is the editor of the pioneering volume on Asian feminist biblical studies. So don't miss the opportunity to listen to these two colleagues. I want to thank Dr. Muriel Ovevillo-Montenegro again for her wonderful and lively presentation and joining me this evening, and for our Asian sisters and brothers, a morning. Goodbye and all the blessings.